You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. Peace of mind sounds like three simple words until they become the hardest thing to find. Stay tuned for a profound personal journey in today's episode. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we explore the elusive quest for peace of mind and what happens when life leads us to unexpected places. Our guest openly shares the complexities of his personal journey, reflecting on how undiagnosed mental health challenges silently shaped his experiences. Jonathan Kemp is a mental health advocate, entrepreneur, and creator of Smart Wisdom, a scientifically validated note-taking technique. Born into privilege as the future third Viscount Rochdale, he built careers in law enforcement and entrepreneurship and undertook postgraduate study, unaware that bipolar disorder, depression, and dyslexia were shaping his life. His mental illnesses were diagnosed aged 39 when he finally sought professional help. Jonathan won the British Dyslexia Association's Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 2011. Here is my interview with Jonathan Kemp, Viscount Rochdale. Hi, Jonathan. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because finding peace of mind is not just an intriguing topic, but I think one that is so relevant in today's time and that so many of our listeners can relate to in various different ways. So thank you for joining me today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Petra. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, it's my absolute pleasure. And I know that you have so many things to share today. So let's start off with maybe a little bit about yourself and maybe the part of your story or the part of your journey that you'd like to start us off with that connects to what you do today or what you'd like to speak about today so our listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Yes, by all means. Really, what I'm doing today is a summation of everything I've been through. And at the moment, I've just finished writing a book titled Finding Peace of Mind, which is a memoir, but it's really of three sections. So the first one is my story, which I'll talk a little bit about. The second section is my insights of what I found has worked and not worked. And then the third part is references, because I wanted to create a piece of work that was genuinely very useful for other people, whether they are suffering themselves or they're mental health professionals. My story really begins very early on, age probably 6, 7. And by then, I already knew that there was something different about me. And I found just living at times really tough. I sometimes say this, and it sounds a bit harsh, but I genuinely, at some moments, wished I'd never been born. And that was by the age of sort of 6, 7. I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know why. I came from a very privileged background, and there was always a disconnect I felt between me and people around me and my background, and I felt I never belonged. But interestingly, and I only made this connection actually this week, I felt I never belonged wherever I was, whether it was at school or in my work or when studying. And I think that wasn't really caused by what I was doing or where I was, but it was more because of the mental health illnesses and the neurodiversity. So I went to British boarding schools, which start age 7. And I struggled. I think coming out of it and looking back, I was very lucky to have gone to that type of school. I'd say the biggest benefit was that I made some really good friends who I'm still in contact with today. So that was the positives, but I really struggled, and I really struggled with the academic work. So I think by then I'd basically decided that I was stupid. Yeah, I just couldn't study, and my exam performance was poor. I then went to a second boarding school because in the UK, if you go to boarding schools, you switch about the age of 12, 13 from your first boarding school to the second one. And same thing, looking back, the greatest thing were the friendships, but I really struggled with the studying. And by the age of 16, I just thought, well, I won't say it because it's a swear word, but I just thought I'd had enough. And it was actually the time that punk rock came out in the UK, and I just became a full-on punk rocker. It was an amazing time because it was just when it was all starting. I didn't do well in the exams again. By the time I left school, I remember one evening sitting at home thinking, there is something seriously wrong with me. And probably starting then, maybe earlier, I really had two objectives. The first one was to find peace of mind. It wasn't to have an amazing career or anything else. It was, I had to try and find peace of mind. And then the second objective was to prove I wasn't stupid to no one else, but primarily to myself. From there, I did all sorts of things. I worked in restaurants. I trained as a bricklayer. I was a cowboy in Australia, which beyond any doubt was one of the best years of my life. It was absolutely amazing. I was a police officer in London for 12 years. In work, I was involved in a lot of the big things that were happening there. I then left to go to university because I'd never been after school. And I did a diploma and then a master's degree. And the objective there was to prove to myself that I wasn't stupid. But at that point, so I'm like in my early 30s, I still had no idea that I have dyslexia. And I knew I had mental health challenges, but I had no idea what it was. And for the whole of that period, so it was 2 years of study, the dyslexia, I now, again, with benefit of hindsight, triggered the bipolar. And every piece of coursework, because I felt really stressed and I couldn't do it, et cetera, every single piece of work, I'd be given it. Within a day, I'd have a crash. My brain would be scraping along the bottom. And then because there was like a week or 2 week turnaround, I'd then figure out how to do it. And then suddenly my mind and my emotions would shoot off into the clouds, and I'd be thinking I'm going to get distinction, that I'd get my next piece of coursework, crash. And I did that for 2 years. I got distinction on my first course and nearly a distinction on the second. And I came out of it. I was absolutely, completely burnt out. I worked in shipping for a little bit, and then I set up my business. And what my business was, I developed a technique to help people manage information better. So it's like a more efficient way of taking notes and making notes. And I've been doing that for the last 20 years. But at the same time, just trying to find solutions so I could live at peace with myself. A big change around came when I was about 39, and I'm really stubborn. For 20 years, I flatly refused to see any doctor or therapist or psychiatrist, and certainly not take any medication, because I viewed that as a weakness or an admission of defeat. And in my mind, I should be able to sort my brain out, which, again, looking back now, is ludicrous. It's be like saying, I've got diabetes and I should be able to think my diabetes away. There's absolutely no difference. And really, over those 20 years, it was a series of getting help, doing what the doctor said, sometimes not, crashing again, things becoming desperate, me then paying more attention to what I was doing. And I thought I'd pretty much buttoned it. And then COVID came along, and I thought, this is going to be easy because I know what feeling terrible is. So this should be like a walk in the park. How wrong I was. What I'd never really appreciated up until that point was how important community was, and just being around people. I didn't necessarily need to even speak to people. It was just being around people was absolutely crucial. And mentally, I really struggled within the first few weeks. And I also had I think at least 3, maybe slightly more, quite substantial bipolar highs. So when you have a bipolar high, they're called. So I'm there are three types of bipolar. There's bipolar type 1, where you have a high, but then you go beyond sanity and you start seeing and hearing things which aren't there. So you experience like extreme mania, and then you crash, you come down, you have the depression, and then you go off again. So I'm bipolar type 2, which means I go right up to that edge. But fortunately, I don't have the psychosis. I have what they call hypermania. But when the stress becomes too much, I will crash within 24 hours. And it takes roughly 6 to 8 weeks for my brain to feel any semblance of normality. And for the first 1 or 2, maybe 3 weeks, it is literally like my brain's been removed. It's quite extraordinary. And then the third type of bipolar is what they call cyclothymia, where you can experience the highs and the lows almost simultaneously. So I had 3 highs and substantial crashes. And each time I can't keep putting up with this. And I thought about writing a book. And then I thought, there's no way I'm going to do it unless I've got like some sort of stability. But I had actually started writing a section of it, and specifically around what to do when things go bad. And so I had another crash. I was at my wit's end. And if I'll be honest, I was on my way out. I've put up with this thing for 40 plus years, 50 years, and I was just fed up with it. And when I'm in trouble, because I've got a really strong will and I'm really stubborn, highly focused, and I know I'm in danger when I just lose that will to live. I thought to myself, God, I have no idea what to do. Because when I have a crash, it's like all the ideas and thoughts about what may or may not help literally just disappear. And I remembered I'd started writing like what I call an emergency action plan of what to do when things go bad. And I thought, all right, I'll go and have a look at it. So I had a look at it. And the first thing was to be open-minded and willing. And when I read that, I had the same reaction as when I first thought of it. But that was the number one priority. I was winced inside because when I'm struggling, the last thing I want to do or be is open-minded and willing. I want to just retreat into a corner and figure this all out myself. And then number 2 was to go and see my local doctor, which again is probably a really obvious thing to do. But when I'm struggling, historically, I've not done it. And I'll wait until about 3-4 months later. And when I go and see the doctor, yes, 3-4 months ago, it was really tough. But actually seeing them when it's going on was a different paradigm. So I did that. I went to see my local doctor. And then number 3 on my list was to take any actions or medication that they recommended. And I was referred to a psychiatrist. I saw one within about a week because I've now got quite a long history with my doctor. And she recommended I take new medications. So I'd been on the same meds now for about 20 years. And typically for people with bipolar, so I have long periods of depression. And sometimes it's difficult to do. Am I having just depression, or is that depression part of the bipolar? But certainly I would say that my number one challenge is the bipolar. And I take 2 medications for that. One to stop the mood swings, which through willpower alone, I can't stop. And the second one is an antidepressant, which then once I've got that sort of steady mood, the antidepressant means the steady mood is in a sort of middle range of, say, if 1 is terrible, 10 is being hypomanic, I want to be between 4 and 6. That's where I want to stay. And I changed the medications on her advice. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. Took a few months to settle in. And for the first time ever, I experienced medically induced depression. Unbelievable. It made my regular depression, which was pretty horrendous, seem like child's play almost. And the psychiatrist said, look, don't increase the mood stabilizer, which was supposed to help with depression, but wasn't helping me with it. And then she introduced an antidepressant. And then after about, I'd say 3-4 months, it was like a miracle. It wasn't an effort to live. It wasn't an effort to breathe. It wasn't an effort to think. It was like an absolute miracle. And it's been pretty much that way now for 2.5 years. Yeah. So that's where I'm at today. And because I've had this sort of long period of mental stability, I decided, right, I'm going to get this book finished. I'm going to do the things that I'm thinking of doing one of which is a walk for a charity from very top of Scotland, the islands at the top of Scotland, the Shetland Islands, down to Land's End, and then the length of Wales, and then I'm going to cross over and do the length of Ireland for the whole purpose of raising awareness about mental health. And yeah, that's the game plan.
First off, I just want to thank you for sharing your journey so far. I get a sense that it's almost trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle, and very often they don't fit. And there's not many people you can ask how these pieces should fit or what might help. So it seems like a process of a lot of trial and error that you have gone through to figure out something that helps you. And it also sounds to me like this knowledge of what actually was going on came fairly late in your life. You went through your childhood and your adolescence not really aware that bipolar was going on, which I'm guessing made this also extremely difficult because you weren't receiving any support that may have helped. So thank you for sharing this. I feel like our listeners, many of whom might be in similar situations, might be feeling that same way of they may have to do this all by themselves, or they have to lone wolf this mental health journey. So I'm very glad and very humbled that you're here today sharing that and bringing the focus to the fact that community can help, that talking about it will help, and that sharing these experiences will connect us in a way that might provide more support in these challenges. Thank you for that. And wow, we talked a little bit about your plan to do the walk for charity. So I'm going to ask our listeners to stay tuned on that. There'll be more coming as we get closer to that. But what an endeavor and a great way to highlight mental health challenges and bipolar as well. Now, tell me a little bit about your decision behind finally sharing what was happening or seeking help and support in what was happening. Do you have siblings or family also? And how did that tie in with your relationships or how you were living life in that sense? I imagine there'd be a big impact with dyslexia and bipolar. So how did all that come together to make you decide at some point to share this and find support for this?
Again, it's been a gradual process. One of the motivations for me to share my knowledge and experience is the fact that I've got 20 years experience of trying to do it myself, like really full on anything and everything I could think of. And then I got 20 years experience of getting proper professional medical help, which sometimes I followed and sometimes I didn't. So I got huge experience in both camps that I'm going to do it myself or I'm going to get professional medical help. And one of the things that I hope by sharing my story is that people don't have to go through 40 years worth of experimentation, is that they can go and see their doctor or their mental health team, get an assessment, and then take the appropriate actions, buy the books, the appropriate books, join the appropriate self-help groups. There's a lot that one can do very quickly. And you don't go and need to do all the things I did, trying to make lots of money. When I was in the police, it was never enough. But whatever I did was never enough. I got heavily involved in the stock market. I started property renovation, and all of this, I was at the same time working shift work in the police. If I take a couple of questions, so the first one around what was the impact with the family, siblings. So I've deliberately in my book not mentioned anything really about my family background other than my grandparents because of the aristocratic title and the implications of that, and also my father, who's passed away. But everyone else, I've sort of made casual reference, but I haven't said if I've had any siblings or not. In reality, for most of the time, my family's been quite disconnected. Any siblings that I might have, we don't really have close contact. And the people who sort of saw what was happening were either colleagues or friends or people I was at school with. I was always very, very sort of circumspect, and I would tell my left hand as little about what my right hand was doing as possible. And I did that with everything. So in my police reports, the comment often was that I was a bit of a dark horse and nobody knew anything about me. And that was deliberate because I think there were so many elements that I was either confused about or embarrassed about or all sorts of things that I didn't trust anybody. So I kept myself to myself. The other thing that became really apparent, and again, a lot of this benefit of hindsight, as I said, is if I'm out and about, I can put on a face, and I can do that unless things are really bad. I can pretty much do that in all situations. And it may not be a perfect me, but I certainly wouldn't allude to what was going on. And then when I'd come home, then I could basically just sit on a chair and just like, okay. One of the greatest challenges I had was after getting married to my partner was suddenly there was someone else in my personal space. And that I found really, really tough because now there was nowhere I could sort of be myself. And if I didn't want to talk to anybody while I was in, that was absolutely fine. I found that tough. And I think it was very tough for my partner. And also, we didn't really understand what was going on. In addition to the bipolar and the dyslexia and the depression, I also have an addictive personality. It sort of, I was about to say comes with the territory, but I think it's certainly some of the other friends that I've got, either who have addictive personalities, also have mental health issues, and other friends that I've got who have mental health issues, some of them have addictive personalities. And one thing that's really helped me was 12-step support groups. Probably the best known is Alcoholics Anonymous. And I qualify probably for every single one of them. I chose one, stuck with it, and sort of worked through the program. And actually, I was hoping, this was in my mid-20s, that by working through the program, that would sort out what was going on in my head, which it did momentarily, but there wasn't a long solution. So I think going back to what you said, it has been a long journey of just trying all sorts of things. Some things work, some things didn't. What usually prompted me to move on to something else was, well, desperation.
Yeah. What I hear a lot in the mental health community and people I speak to is that there is a lot of shame that happens when people have different mental illness experiences or different mental health challenges. And there's a lot of shame around opening that up to people that know you really well because that means showing that something is not right. It means showing that you can't do it all by yourself. And as you said, maybe perceiving that as a weakness to try and get help. So if you look back now and you do have the benefit of hindsight now with the experience that you've had with professional medical help as well, how do you feel about not getting that support and help earlier? Do you feel like that kept you from having a fuller life or more experiences that may have been more joyful for you or generally a better life quality? Or how do you look back at that from your standpoint today? And especially for our listeners who might be listening in and having some of those feelings of fear or shame of sharing this with someone else. What is your take on that now, looking back?
Looking back, one of the approaches that I take generally is when things aren't going my way or something, for want of a better word, bad has happened, is I will look for a way of reinterpreting what has happened and I will look for the upsides in that. So, for example, I was disinherited by my father from our estate and belongings when he passed away. And I sort of knew it was coming, but he sent me a letter, which I got, I think, about 5 or 6 days after his death, which he'd written 10 years before to tell me why he was going to disinherit me. I read through this letter and it's just like, what? I found it very difficult to understand where he was coming from. But quite quickly, I sort of started thinking, well, okay, well, what's the upside here? And one upside, for me is that fact that I'm able to live in London. I don't have any distractions and I can focus on doing something that is really meaningful for me, such as writing this book and then talking about my experiences. There were lots of sort of examples like that. And then another thought I had was actually, which really helped, was that my inheritance was my disinheritance, which was a complete turnaround in thinking. And that made a lot of sense. I think when looking back, I sort of look back now through that lens. Well, okay, that happened, but what's the upside of that happening? And the reason I do that is because that type of thinking gives me a better quality of life here in the now. One of the things I was really conscious about doing was avoiding all self-pity and resentment when writing the book. So when I gave it to a professional male editor, then a female editor, and I asked both of them to ensure that there was not even a smidge of self-pity or resentment. I think looking back, if I had had the solutions and help that I now know is available, but in reality wasn't available back then, I would have had a very, very different life. I was about to say a much easier life. I think almost certainly a much easier life. But when I was growing up, there was that huge shame about anything that made you different. And mental health wasn't understood. It was still, if someone was having a problem, they were a bit of a loony. If they were in a psychiatric hospital, they were in the nut house. So a lot of the language that I used and my friends used was the language that they were using sort of in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and not much had changed. And I think it's changed hugely in the last 10 to 15 years, and it's changed beyond all recognition since COVID. So I think one of the benefits of COVID was that it was a universal experience worldwide, probably one of the first universal experiences worldwide. And everybody had the same impact. We were all forced to be on our own, which then meant things like mental health couldn't be hidden anymore, because some of the ways we helped to manage our mental well-being around other people, talking with other people, just wasn't there anymore. And I mean, to give you an example, I was in Vietnam 2 years ago, and I made a decision that if anybody asked me what I was doing, I'd talk about the book, and it was about mental health, et cetera, et cetera. And what really amazed me, because I wasn't quite sure how people would react, what really amazed me is that people were genuinely interested. And two comments sort of stuck in my mind. One was pre-COVID, no one ever talked about these sorts of things. But post-COVID, people are now much more open, much more aware, and are now hungry for information. And I think in terms of the learning curve, acceptance curve, probably in the UK, we're a bit further ahead than some of the countries in East Asia. I believe certain sections of America are further ahead than ourselves. What I would say to other people, if you think that something's not right, I would try and get professional help as soon as you can, just to start to get an understanding of what the things could be. So, for example, and again, I've only quite recently sort of joined the dots on this one, is that from school, very early on, all the way through to my early 40s, I had this constant interference in my head. It was almost like electricity going off, but it was like this just constant interference. And I now believe that for myself, it's part of the bipolar illness, because once I started taking a mood stabilizer, it just went. So like the last 2.5 years, I haven't had it at all. And if it does come, it's sometimes because I've forgotten my medication. So it's a reminder that I need to take my medication. But aside from that, it's just not there anymore. And I had that on and off for 20, 30 years.
Wow.
What I would say, and then particularly with dyslexia as well, that's another thing. I didn't get assessed until I was 49.
No.
And when I did my master's degree, I had no idea. So I was like 34. I had no extra help. I was studying 1.5 to 2 times more than everybody else. And I had no idea. Do I regret that? Not really, because I was competing with everyone on an equal footing and being highly competitive. That sort of appeals.
I love your smile about that, making it a little bit more difficult for yourself there. Wow. Yeah, I feel like I can relate to a lot of the things that you're sharing with us. And I do feel that things have changed, especially post-COVID. And there's a lot more, I think, open-mindedness toward mental health challenges, sort of, as you said, maybe in different parts of the world, there are varying degrees of that. But I do feel like we're moving more to where this is talked about more, because also this mental health experience has been so universal for everyone. And I would say that the majority of people didn't walk away from COVID extremely happy. I think they were affected in some kind of way that prevented just putting a mask on and pretending that we were okay like we did before. So certainly I relate to that as well. Now, for yourself, having found something that works for you now and having spent the last couple of years in a much better quality of life for yourself, do you feel that there were other things outside of the medication that you found that helped you along the way? Anything else that you feel contributed to having a better quality of life? There's people that I'm sure will see their doctors and they will test the medications and try and hopefully find something that works for them. Is there any other things that you found helpful outside of that?
Quite a few things. One of the things that occurred to me during COVID was, so I'd spent a lot of my sort of late 20s going to different self-help groups where the focus was on working the program. And if you work the program, then things would get better. And certainly in terms of on the addiction side, yes, things did improve. But again, that's very much a journey. But what I realized during COVID was, regardless of who I see or which medical professional I see or which program I work, there are a number of things that I can do when I'm feeling terrible, which, okay, they might not change how I feel, but one element of success which helps me survive each day is the fact that I've done these things, which I know are good for my body and good for my mind, although I might not fully appreciate it right now. And then certainly when I'm well, these things are crucial for managing well-being. And during COVID, I'm highly analytical by nature. And I kept a record, like a daily record. And I was trying to identify what things worked and what things didn't work and what helped. And I had a scoring system. So if I had 7.5 hours sleep, I'd get 2 points. And if I had a breakfast rather than skipping it and trying to start work straight away, I'd get another 2 points. And the aim was to get 30 points every day. And that's how I kept going. But from that, it really came together when I was writing the book. I thought, actually, there's the medical aspect, which is crucial. And that for me is the building block. But then there's a whole structure for living life each day in a way that makes sense and is rewarding in of itself. Whereas historically, I would think, okay, when I've made X millions of pounds, then I'll be okay. When I've set up this property renovation business, then I'll be okay. When I become a detective chief inspector on the drug squad, then I'll be okay. Whereas now it's about, so I'll give you some examples. So one of my foundations is sleep, crucial. I need about 8 hours sleep. And then there are a whole range of things that I can do to enhance that quality. So I have like blackout blinds. I don't take my laptop in. Well, a little bit of a lie, because sometimes I do. I try and turn off my electronics an hour before. So there's a whole range of things to try and make sleep optimum. Number 2 is mindfulness. And I think this came to the fore during COVID again. But for me, mindfulness is doing things like meditating, which I don't have a spiritual experience around it. But I think what it does, it helps my brain calm down and it helps me to be in the moment and appreciate the moment. And the reason I'm pausing is that what I've noticed in the last 2.5 years, which I hadn't noticed before, and I made a real effort of just trying to be in the moment, is that I will think of things like, oh, someone hasn't contacted me, or, oh, someone hasn't done this. I mean, it's happened too many times for it to be a coincidence. And each time I think of these things, somebody will contact me. And it happened again this morning. So for me, I'm not a religious person, but I believe there is a strong spiritual element to our lives, which I can't explain. So mindful is really important. So that makes things like doing a weekly plan really important, doing a daily plan really important, crossing things off as I do them, because all of these things help me to stay and live in the moment. And then when I'm outside, just focusing on the air, feeling it on my arms, feeling it on my face, looking at the clouds, looking at the beautiful buildings where I live, all of these things help me to stay in the moment. And number 3 of the 14 is community. Rather than, I have my own business, but rather than working from my flat, what I do in the morning, I go to one coffee shop. I've been going there for about 2 years now. And I won't necessarily say a lot, but that's deliberate because traditionally I would go in, I'd try and make everyone laugh, which was all part of the hypermania. And now deliberately I'll go in, I might say, how are you? How's today? Et cetera, et cetera. And then I go to a different coffee shop in the afternoon. I go to the same place where I either do running or go to the gym or swimming. But all of this is deliberate to help me to sort of build like a community. And then I do a range of other things. So in answer to your question, I think medication is crucial for solving the illness. But in terms of actually having a really good quality of life, then for me, these foundations are just as crucial. And if I didn't have the medication, the foundations would still help, but not nearly as enough as if I sort out the medication side as well. Does that make sense?
That actually makes a lot of sense. It feels like you're building a little bit of a structure for yourself to sort of have the daily challenges, the weekly challenges, and giving yourself a point system, which keeps you focused on what's happening throughout your day in the pursuit of your own wellness, which of course is the goal of that. So actually, I find this very creative, and I think this might be helpful for our listeners as well to find their own way to give themselves these structures or these systems that will help them come throughout the day back to themselves and back to the moment and finding out what it is that actually helps them in addition to any medical aspects they might be pursuing. So thank you for sharing that. I find that a very, very great insight and one of those little, I think, nuggets that our listeners can take away from that. Before we wrap up, Jonathan, I would just like to ask you what you would have found helpful for people in your inner circle, your family, your friends. What would you have found helpful that they could have done to support you in this? I feel like very often we're also on the outside. Maybe a loved one is struggling with their mental health, maybe a sibling or a family member. We don't always know what to say or how to approach that, or we might feel like we might make it worse by asking about it. So from your perspective, what would have helped you or what would be helpful if there is a loved one that wants to support someone when there are mental health challenges that they can see that the person's maybe struggling or they're having a hard time or they're depressed? Anything that would be helpful in that sense?
That's a really good question. And I think there's no right or wrong way. But in general, I would say that if you're a loved one or a friend or a colleague and you think someone is struggling or their behavior is a bit off, is just to ask them the question, is everything okay? And somebody says okay and they're clearly not okay, and you can see that and interpret that from either their voice or their behavior, is then I would ask another question, would you like to have a chat about it? And then I'd say, well, what would you like to chat about? So rather than imposing myself, I will try and ask questions to be invited to help. Having said that, I think another approach, particularly, you have knowledge and understanding of what the issues might be, is sort of like just popping in. Would it be worth seeing the doctor? Would it be worth going to X self-help group? Would it be worth having a chat with Fiona or Frank, who have similar issues? So I think it's a question, sort of one is of respect, so asking them if they would like to talk about things, and if so, when and how. Another one is you see things are going wrong, they don't want to talk about it. So then the other thing is to, well, you could grab them by the scruff of the neck and take them along to wherever you think they should do, but that probably won't work, is go for the sort of gentle nudge. Well, what about this? Could you do this? Could you do that? But I think when someone is suffering, addiction is like really painful to watch and impacts everyone, as does other mental health illnesses. I think there's the asking for permission, there's the making of suggestions, and then at some point you have to sort of start thinking of yourself. And in some situations, you have to let go. And actually, yourself, your mental well-being, mental health is actually the priority. Because if somebody refuses to change, like I refused to get help for 20 years, there's a cowboy expression, you can drag a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. And that was me. So I think overall, one needs to always have in mind that your mental well-being, mental health is actually the most important. And if you can keep that in good check and in good spirit, then that puts you in a better position to help others.
Yeah, beautifully said. And thank you for sharing that. And I do feel like that can be one of the most difficult pieces of wanting to be helpful to someone, but that person not yet being ready or open to any of that, and how that affects then you as the outsider. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. And while we wrap up here, I just want to mention again to our listeners that the book that you wrote will be coming out on World Mental Health Day. We will be airing this episode actually on October 10th. And at that time, you can also find Jonathan's book, Finding Peace of Mind. So we will link to that in the show notes. Any other resources or anything else that you would like to share with our listeners and how they can connect or find some support or find some help or anything else that you'd like to share with them?
I suppose two things. So one is I will have an author website, which will be jonathankemp.com. And on that, I'll be sharing my experience through blogs. I'll also be sharing about my walk, my little walk next year. In terms of extra bits of advice, I think, again, it's maybe the last 5-10 years. I think now there are some really great resources online with mental health charities. So, for example, in the UK, one of our mental health charities is called Mind. Another one is called Bipolar UK. There's Alcoholics Anonymous for drinking and different fellowships. That's Workaholics Anonymous, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the dyslexia charities. And what's good, and I sort of particularly noticed it on Mind recently, was there's like lots of really easy to follow, easy to sort of assess yourself check sheets. There's a lot of information out there now, which is completely free. So that could be another starting point.
Wonderful. We'll link to those resources that you mentioned in the show notes as well. And keep us posted on your upcoming walk. I'm hoping that we can connect on that again and then bring our listeners some more details on that as you're starting and progressing with that journey. We'd love to bring that to the listeners so they can follow along with your walk. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jonathan, and sharing your story with our listeners and with myself, and really being open and vulnerable about what that mental health journey has looked like for you. I feel like there's a lot of connection for our listeners and individuals who are going through some of these challenges to really find some help, find some support. Don't try and do this on your own, because you will get a much better quality of life if you can find some support earlier on. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. And thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And all the best with your book launch, all the best with your charity walk, and take really good care of yourself, Jonathan.
Thank you, Petra. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejōrni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.